Now I want to turn to the empirical side of this discussion. Up to now, we've talked a lot about how these relationships between land and property rights and growth should work or could work. We've looked at a case in Tanzania where they are evolving. I want to talk about some of the empirical evidence from the research literature about what we actually see in practice about this, these relationships. So first, I would like to bring out a couple of studies that have been done at the very macro level, comparing the rates of growth and the type of growth of countries, comparing countries over long time spans. And we have one, this is the Knack and Kiefer study from 1995, which does show that countries with a higher index of property rights protection grow faster over the long term. And so we see that relationship at the macro countrywide level in country-to-country comparison. There's another similar study which looked at property rights institutions and historical levels of economic growth. This is the Acemoglu study, looking at 64 countries, and showed the same type of relationship of highly significant impact of property rights institutions on the rate of growth. Countries with better protection of property rights and stronger institutions having a higher rate of growth compared to those that did not have those institutions. And so we have the conclusion from another one of his studies that there is convincing empirical support for the hypothesis that differences in economic institutions, rather than geography or culture, causes differences in income per capita. The other type of studies and type of evidence are really country-specific and are focused on more micro sectors or groups within the economy. And in these, the same type of relationships are also widely observed in different parts of the world. In Thailand, very well-known study by Fader and associates from the late 80s showed that land titling increases investment, usage of inputs, and output, especially where institutional credit was available. And that, again, that assumption of how credit and property rights can work together. Another example from Ethiopia, where studies of, primarily in the rural context, showed productivity increases of 40 to 45% 6 or 7 years after land certification, and showing that investments into soil and water infrastructure were 30% more likely on parcels that had the land certification, so that incentive to invest and take care of the property. Another study of this type was done in Ghana and showed similar results, where tree planting in cocoa areas increased significantly in areas with tenure security. Another example from this literature is a study in China, in where it shows in areas with property registration, the probability of investment into those properties was increased by 76% versus those which had not had property registration. A similar result in studies from Rwanda, where the presence of land certificates shows a doubling in the amount of investment into soil conservation relative to those without land certification. In Peru, an example from Latin America, same type of result about a strong investment effect onto parcels which had titling and registration versus those without. I think there's also, in terms of the conflict channel that we discussed, interesting empirical evidence from the literature. In Uganda, for example, plots in which there was a conflict or a dispute about tenure had 20% lower yields than ones without, and where there was the parcel occupant felt a risk of eviction, yields were 37% lower than on other parcels. Burkina Faso, another example of the relationship between disputes and yields, where a study found that productivity was reduced by 40% when households had concerns about disputes. And in Ethiopia, studies have shown that insecure tenure led to inefficient contracts and productivity losses of up to 24%. In Mozambique, the studies there have shown also that a complicated land transfer policy is linked to the underutilization of land. And in South Africa, studies there show that food consumption increases with land access. And I think that issue of food security with land access and land security is a very important one in this whole area.